Well, hello and good day if you're listening to the podcast later on in the week. My name's David Young. I'm a member of Boot Brisbane up here in Cairns, and with me tonight is our special guest, Max Tomlinson.
Oh, good day.
Tomlinson, sorry, and also Bill Bates. Good evening.
Good evening, David. Nice to be with you.
Yeah, thank you for joining us, mate. Now, Max, you were originally born and raised in Melbourne and moved to Townsville in 1973 after completing a cadetship at the Herald. You moved up when you were in Townsville, started in 1973 as a journalist and chief of staff.
Yep.
You've moved in various you've worked for various papers in the area: Charters Towers, Innisfail, Atherton, Bowen, Ayr, Home Hill, and life has kept you busy being the managing director of the Post Courier. You've been a chairman and managing director for the North Queensland Newspaper Company. You've also, I see here, been a managing director of the Adelaide Advertiser.
Yep, that's right, David.
You've been a media and political advisor for Senator Ian MacDonald, who unfortunately is no longer a senator, lost at the last election.
Yep.
And you've been even a director and chairman of a number of organisations around Townsville, including the Cowboys and the Whitsunday TAFE College. Now, you're now retired, and I see you kept busy by 4 grandchildren as well, but how do you find the political environment for Central and North Queensland as being ripe for the picking for a creation of a new state?
Well, I'm not so sure that it is ripe for the picking. I think there's some more work to be done. The recent survey that Bill Bates and his organisation commissioned and we heard about here in Townsville earlier this week shows that there's a fairly large undecided vote. Which is a positive in some respects because it means that those undecided people can be swayed to the notion of a new state, and I think there is an appetite there for autonomy here in North Queensland and in Northern Australia generally. So I think there is an appetite there, but if you ask me to put my finger out into the breeze and test the wind, I think there's more work to be done.
There's always more work to be done in certain things, and look, there's always that percentage of the population that needs to be convinced or unconvinced, likewise, of a big change and a big step in the direction that might be beneficial or may not be, according to certain types. But in your opinion, having been involved in the Central and North Queensland and Townsville area, how do you find that the representation has diminished, and do you think it's noticeable, especially in a place like Townsville?
Well, I think if you look at the history of the North, if you go back to the 1860s, 1870s, places like Bowen, if you go to Bowen, you'll see the big wide streets, substantial public buildings. The town of Bowen, or the city of Bowen as it was groomed to be back in the 1860s, was to be the capital of Northern Australia or North Queensland after Dalrymple discovered the port there. And it's a beautiful place, beautiful natural port. The immigrants to North Queensland would arrive there, get on the Cobb and Co coach over the Leichhardt Range to the goldfields at Ravenswood and Charters Towers. And the place was run by very, very powerful business tycoons or entrepreneurs, you might call them, and very strong politicians, and underpinned, of course, by a lot of privately owned newspapers throughout the North. And I think back in that period of time, that was the time when the North was ripe for separation. In fact, I think if you look back to even further to the 1840s, Northern Australia was a separate entity from New South Wales at that time, and I think it was destined to be a penal colony at that time. So it shows, I think, what the Southerners thought of this part of Australia back in those times, and I doubt very much whether that thinking has changed all that much. They see us as a place they can easily forget. We don't have the population up here, nor the powerful newspaper families that we once had back in those days. And as a result, our voice is somewhat muffled.
Well, that's true, and distance can be an enemy to any people that's separated from a place where they're governed. But as you say, the more localised media outlets like there was back in the turn of the century obviously allowed for greater communication and greater throwing around of ideas and ideals and what they had planned for the future. And having worked at places like the very many media outlets you have, would you say that the more localised a voice, the better?
Oh, of course. Back in the before News Corporation and Fairfax and APN, these large conglomerates came along, there were some very famous families running the newspapers. Here you had the Lewis family in Proserpine, the Darwins in Bowen, the Shepherds in Ingham, and the Groom brothers, Spencer and George Groom in Innisfail. The Green brothers running the Northern Miner and the North Queensland Newspaper Company. And in Charters Towers in the 1870s, you had a fiery Irish editor and owner called Thaddeus O'Kane. And he was absolutely fearless in his criticism of the political fathers of the time and the wealthy mine owners. And these were pioneering advocates for their communities and very, very strong advocates. And we also had strong politicians at that time. I think the party system in some ways has been the nemesis of any young politician who wanted to stand up and take a stand for the North. If you want to be re-endorsed for your seat, you really have to toe the party line, and that means that you often have to compromise what you want to do with what you have to do to retain your position. And I think in that sense, a lot of the colourful personalities that used to run those newspapers and occupy the political perches in those days have disappeared. It's a sad indictment, I think, of the modern political system.
Well, and we definitely learned a little bit of that from one of our previous guests. I'm not sure. I mean, you'd be well acquainted with Ewan. Was it Ewan Jones? I'm sorry.
Ewan Jones was my mum.
Yeah, he only expressed his devastation about not being re-elected through the party system. And how he thought that having had, I think it was a third term, would have only done good for the area of Central and North Queensland and Townsville in general, but he never got the opportunity because of that system. And I think that's a little bit of what you just touched on, sir.
Yes, well, that was the reason I came back to North Queensland in 2010 to help with Ewan's campaign. The campaign committee asked me to come up and help. I had a small media company at that stage. I was living in Noosa. And I came back up and worked for 6 weeks with Ewan and the campaign committee, and we got him in. We beat the former mayor of Townsville, Tony Mooney, which was a major coup. We were I suppose a motley group of people who loved the North and fought very hard to get Ewan elected. And we got an ordinary guy in, a guy who with a passion for the North, a guy who liked to roll his sleeves up and do what was right and what was fair for the North. It was sad to see him lose the election. But again, I think Ewan, while he was a very vocal and outspoken and zealous, I would have to say, supporter of North Queensland, at the end of the day, he had to fold those ideas and those thoughts and aspirations into the overall goals of the party that he belonged to.
Well,
and the same applies to the Labor Party. We haven't seen any real benefits for the North since Bob Hawke gave us the Burdekin Dam, and that was thanks to the great work done by Ted Lindsay, the member for Herbert at the time. He's a friend of mine, even though we come from opposite sides of the political spectrum. Ted was a great patriotic supporter of North Queensland, and history will show that he was very instrumental in us getting the Burdekin Dam built. The listeners might be interested to learn that when Bob Hawke's draft speech was sent to Ted Lindsay, the sitting member, to review before the election, the actual wording of the draft was that the Hawke Labor government would commit to funding a study into the construction of the Burdekin Dam. Well, Ted Lindsay took a pencil, ran a line through committing to a study of the Burdekin Dam, and suggested that the Labor Party commit to constructing the Burdekin Dam. Now, with that nudge, Bob Hawke altered the speech and committed the Labor government to build the dam. Now, it's hard to imagine that something like that happening in today's economic, rational environment that we find ourselves. You know, the stage 2 of the Burdekin Dam is a no-brainer, but unfortunately it doesn't stack up on the Auditor General or the national government's economic rationalists. Everything has to pay for itself. Now, if that was the case, you would never have built the Sydney Harbour Bridge, you would never have built the railway, you would never have built the telegraph line across Central Australia.
Bill, did you have a thought?
Yeah, I was just going back to in regards to towing the party line. While Ewan was in federal politics, I think our situation is more to deal with the state politics of the system. I mean, we've got a situation now where 11 of the 17 members in Central and North Queensland are ALP members of the government, and that basically makes up 25% of their party room. And considering that's 25% and they only hold a two-seat margin, you would think they would be backing a lot better to deliver for Central and North Queensland, but it doesn't seem to be the case. It seems that I suppose the size of the southeast corners population and their representation always seems to overwhelm the interests of Central and North Queensland and their representatives, no matter how good of representatives we've got. I think we had the same situation when Liberals, LNP, were in for a short time under Newman. We had some very good members in Cairns area, but they basically never got a word in, sort of thing, because unfortunately they won by such a big margin. They didn't have any sort of real clout within the party. So that's got to be always a problem dealing with the southeast corner and its high population, its high representation. And really, until such time we move out away from the influence of southeast Queensland in its sheer numbers and have only a parliament of our own, well then maybe the parties that we Liberal and Labor, of course, of Northern Queensland, the state of Northern Queensland, they can generate policies that in our best interest rather than trying to generate policies in such a vast state with such vast different needs from corner to corner.
Yeah,
well, and Ewan even touched on that as well when he mentioned he was down in the meeting room for the LNP when they were in government, and we got the same dumbfounded looks when he would mention the needs of the Townsville area, and they would go, "What?"
Yes, well, I think you know we've all been in Melbourne and Sydney and Brisbane, and we're all well aware of just how ignorant people are of the North. When I was living in Bowen and running the Bowen Independent, we would have people calling us and saying that they delivered national advertising material to Bowen Hills, and they thought that was Bowen. And when we would point out, "Oh no, look, that's 1,000 kilometres south of here," they were absolutely gobsmacked. And even now, if you go to Brisbane, you say you're from North Queensland, they really have no idea of the vastness or the distances involved and the different challenges that we face up in this part of the world. So it's still a bit of a mystery, a bit like WA. I don't know, you were born there, Bill. You would understand that sense of isolation and that.
I don't see, because the North is so sparsely populated, it doesn't have that sort of, well, we can look after ourselves situation, because there's so few people. I think north of Carnarvon, I think there's only about 26,000 people altogether. And when you talk about, go to the same line of latitude in Queensland, you're talking about nearly 750,000 people. It's a completely different thing. And the other thing, in the southern corner, if you talk about the triangle between Perth, Kalgoorlie, and Albany, we don't have that sort of parochialism or feeling that we're left out sort of thing. So it's a completely different dynamic. We still, in West Australia, we always felt we're West Australians, no matter where you were. However, I've got to admit, my first experience when I joined the Air Force as a young 15-year-old going to Melbourne and joining up with the 60 other people who came from all across Australia, and we had about 20-odd people from Queensland, 20 people from New South Wales, Victoria, a spattering of Tasmanians, South Australians and West Australians. And it was really noticeable within the first few weeks how parochial the Queenslanders were in regards to where they came from in Queensland and who didn't really associate with who, and it was really strange to us. And as a group, they were the first group to sort of disintegrate and hook up with people from other states rather than stay in their own collective. So that's my first sort of inkling in regards to Queenslanders are different, if I can say that.
Well, you did say that you had 20 odd Queenslanders in your group. I wondered whether the odd might have been intentional.
No. Just I think it might have been 22 or something like that. But they were always throughout the history of the apprentice scheme, both in the Air Force, Navy, and Army. Queenslanders always seem to make up somewhere between, disproportionately for their population. They were made up 30 and sometimes 40% of the whole recruitment, because you had so many people from regional areas coming in for that opportunity of employment and picking up a trade and furthering themselves, sort of thing. So that was a dynamic I noticed. And then the other dynamic I've noticed since moving to Queensland I first started coming up here regularly in about 2006 and settled in 2012. But gee whiz, the parochialism between regions is something, to be amazed at. And I believe that Brisbane plays it for all it's worth, and we're really suckers to it. I mean, I cannot believe that you have more animosity or jealousy or rivalry between Townsville and Cairns and Rockhampton and Mackay than you do have animosity or resentment against Brisbane, which is deciding your future on a daily basis and sticking you with legislation that really doesn't fit our regions. But no, you seem to be more rusted on to Brisbane than you are ready to unite together to go forward. It's really a strange phenomenon, because to me the ills of Central and North Queensland is Brisbane. That's the ills. They cause the ills. They come up with the legislation that sort of is not really suited. It's based on inner city wants and needs and intellect, sort of thing, and comes crashing down on us. But we see the long time people of political parties still rusted on to Brisbane's headquarters type policy thing, rather than sort of saying, well, gee whiz, we really need a state of our own and a party of our own, like if you're in the Liberal National Party, well, maybe you need a separate state with a party in the state and that can write policy that suits the area more than try to write policy that tries to encompass such a vast area and such a broad diversity of people and interests.
Yeah, look, I think that parochialism that you talk about, if you drill down even to a more micro level, the differences between communities like Bowen, to Proserpine, for example, Atherton and Mareeba, Ayr and Home Hill, Innisfail and Babinda, although there's not such a great divide there, but if you live and work in those communities, as I did over a period of about 17 years running the smaller newspapers, they're as different as chalk and cheese. Bowen is a working class town with a sense of egalitarianism. You go to the Burdekin, more millionaires in the town of Ayr than in any other North Queensland centre due to the sugar industry. And Home Hill across the other side of the Burdekin River is a different community altogether. So I think the point you make, Bill, is a good one, and it may well be tied up with the fact that the population of Northern Australia is fairly new and it's relatively transient. We've got lots of people who come up here and work for a period of time. They could be in the army, or they could be in the public service. They could be in a seasonal work team picking tomatoes in Bowen or bananas in Innisfail. So I don't know that we've got that strong bedrock of committed locals that the southern centres have got. And that might well be tied up with the fact that the climate up here is pretty harsh, and it takes a special breed of people to want to settle and live in this part of the world. There may be something tied up in that.
Well, Max, I want to bring something up. Bill, I want to bring something up because at what point these smaller communities, and we've spoken about parochialism, but these smaller communities and the fact that their population in the last decade, say, is stagnating or significantly starting to dwindle compared to the growth experienced in certain areas like in the southeast Queensland. But to what point, I want to take one example that's been quite topical for the last few years, is maternity services dwindling in the more remote areas of the state. At what point can the state government, which operates on the bottom dollar, start dwindling services and say it's because of reducing population numbers, or is it a contributing factor in its own right due to that decision making? And you've experienced the smaller communities yourself, Max. Do you think that it's a bit of a horse and cart scenario where, in fact, a response to a certain sort of demographic change can actually be a nail in the coffin?
Well, I think the problem that the smaller communities have to deal with is that businesses, in their quest to maximise returns to shareholders, everything has to pay for itself. Now, in the old days, you would have bank branches in all, if you were Mr. Westpac or Mr. Commonwealth Bank, you would have branches in every town, and you had a thread of a commitment to servicing the community, which doesn't have a price tag or shouldn't have a price tag. But nowadays, everything's got a price tag. So a bank branch in Home Hill, for example, doesn't pay its way, but it provides a wonderful service to the people. Now, I think, and we're seeing this with newspapers and other larger or once prominent organisations. They don't care, or I think it's probably tied up as well with the improvements in communications, where people can get online and do a lot of the mundane tasks such as banking, dealing with Centrelink, and so on. That can now be done through computers. Now, the problem with that is that the older demographic, that don't have access to a computer, are struggling to come to grips with this new world that is common to people living in the big cities, but an absolute mystery to poor people living in the smaller communities. And sitting in Brisbane or Sydney running, say, the Westpac Bank, you look at a branch in Home Hill, I'll use that example again, and you say, what have we got a branch there for? It's costing us a fortune. Why don't they all just get online and do what we do down here in Sydney? Well, you know, you talk to people in the main street of Home Hill, some of them wouldn't know what a computer looks like. So I think that's an issue that we need to grapple with. Look at the News Corporation's decision to shut these small town newspapers down. There's the older demographic in those small communities. They've got no intention of going online and reading the paper or downloading it and printing it so that they can read it at their leisure. You know, newspapers in those small communities are part of people's lives. They go into town on paper day, get their paper, do their banking, sit in the main street and talk to their mates, catch up on the news of the day. That's been completely disrupted by the decision to shut these newspapers down, and that's a decision made in the cold, hard boardrooms of Sydney. They never met a person from Home Hill or Bowen or Atherton or Mareeba.
Well, that's true. It's a decision made based on a dollar value, as opposed to whether or not it's turning up a relatively reasonable profit or not for that local community. And when you start cutting certain aspects of an entity off, that might be letting the whole of the entity down, like News Corp has obviously done. I always actually have, it's quite sad for those smaller communities. But I got lost on a separate thought, because a conversation came into my head that I had with somebody about a week ago. This same scenario is fancy News Corp, and there's no detriment to News Corp operating as a business. It's more as the impact that it has on small communities. Fancy being faced with the decision to shut down a paper that's making a small profit because it didn't make enough of a profit and advertising was dwindling. And it was only a decision based on that bottom dollar value. It's a bit disappointing, but it's understandable at the same time in this big business. But like you say, there's going to be many people disrupted in that age bracket that depend upon that as a news outlet.
Yeah, absolutely, David. Yeah, sorry, Bill.
Yeah, but here's the thing. It's the lack of growth that's this problem. We're not growing. And the reason we're not growing is because we're not getting the infrastructure and investment from the government to grow. So you can understand things being wound back by private enterprise if there isn't the investment or the heart from your state government to make you grow. I mean, everything that's been done in the last, say, 10, 15 years has added costs to the people of Central and North Queensland. Look at electricity. There's not one decision that's been made by the federal or state government that hasn't added costs to either the consumer or businesses in general in a simple delivery system as electricity. So, and they don't care. And until people wake up and say, right, Australia's growing at X number of people per year overall, there's a percentage-wise. If we want to maintain services, we have to continue to grow. And the only way we can grow is if we get a government that puts in the infrastructure that attracts business, provides for lower cost rather than everything they do adds to the cost. I mean, electricity decisions has been absolutely horrendous on this nation over the last, since Rudd and the hookup with renewables and the fear of greening the planet with carbon dioxide. But if we're going to get the basics like that as an inhibitor to growth, we've got a real problem. I mean, I travelled through, I travelled all the way up through Georgetown, Croydon, up to Normanton, then down into Mount Isa, and then back along Julia Creek, and then into Richmond and places like that.
Yeah.
I was in Richmond, and I think most people would know the dinosaur or whatever it is, fossil museum there. And I think the cafe in that is the Blue Moon or something like that, something Moon Cafe. And they could no longer bake their own bread because it was just too expensive. They could only bake some sort of pastries and cakes because there was enough margin in them. But there was no margin in baking their own bread for sandwiches. And so they went to shop 14. I think that's a sad indictment when you sort of kill off, a basic cafe or provider from baking their own bread because you've hiked the price of electricity up so much.
Well, and that was a part of my comment about the fact that which has come first, the horse or the cart, is at what point are these decisions hindering Central and North Queensland from actually growing and prospering to its extent that we can get it back. And that's why we come back to the argument of a new state. If we get that representation, have an avid voice of a healthier voice in both the federal and new state parliament, it would only mean better prosperity and solving these more localised issues.
Yeah, true. Somebody gave me a good example the other day, David and Bill. At the time that the Sydney Harbour Bridge was built, there were 32,000 cars in Sydney. So based on that, you would have perhaps decided to build the bridge, but you would have only made it two lanes. But the forefathers and Bradfield, the designer, they built an 8-lane wide bridge with a railway line each side and a pedestrian and a cycle track or pedestrian track. Now, that sort of bold government thinking doesn't exist today, because they look at it simply as, let's say, the stage 2 of the Burdekin Dam. They would say, how many people live up there? How much per megalitre of water is that going to cost us to build? Oh, no, it's too hard. Let's go and do something else. That's the problem. We don't have that bold decision making that underpins some of the great, look, take that inland telegraph line. That would never have been built if you applied the cost-benefit analysis that seems to apply to every infrastructure project these days.
But it's like your Burdekin in that it's how many people will it bring if you build it, Build it.
Well, that's right. But then, that's so true. It's so true. And look at the American West and how it was developed. If the economic rationalists were running America back in the 18th and 19th centuries, the West would still be a bloody desert.
Well, isn't that a lesson to us that, hey, we need to get away from those economic rationalists in Brisbane and think for ourselves and do for ourselves rather than them making the decisions for us, because there is no way whatsoever they are interested in seeing us grow forward at any fast rate.
Well, especially now we hear, like today, that there's a new committee, 8 representatives to fix the Bruce, and they're all from southeast Queensland, essentially. And same we could say with economic expenditure, where the greatest infrastructure project that we've seen in many years in the state of Queensland is the Cross River Rail, which won't benefit myself. I doubt I'll ever even end up catching the train, even if I go down to Brisbane or the Gold Coast. So it's a terrible situation we find ourselves. A new state would solve that.
Yes, certainly. Well, the listeners might be interested. In 2018, Terry Mills, the former Chief Minister of the Northern Territory, he came to town. He reached out to Jeff Cox, who you guys know, one of Australia's biggest cane farmers, lives in the Burdekin. And he's a very strong advocate for North Queensland separate state, and his cousin Sam Cox, former LNP member for Thuringowa, he came to Townsville and met with Jeff Cox, Sam Cox, and myself, and he put to us a proposition that he had a party called the Territory Alliance, and he was looking to join with interested people in northern Queensland to form a North Australian party to combine the political and commercial interests of the Territory and also North Queensland. Now, that didn't go anywhere for a number of reasons, but it's interesting that Terry Mills, who's still active up there now in a minority sense in the Territory government, I thought he might have been the messiah that we'd all been looking for, someone with the bold vision for northern Australia that would have the energy and the expertise to pull together like-minded people. But unfortunately, it didn't go anywhere. And again, we see Jason Costigan and his party, Henry Frackier and Peter Raffles and his party at Brisbane, and so on. It seems to me that we need a messiah to come along and unite these disparate voices and put an arrowhead on the spear that we're trying to build.
Well, I think that's the thing. You always, somewhere along the line, need some patron who through through the good graces of whatever prosperity they have and sharing that, they can get these people to get together and talk and negotiate. I think that's one of the big difficulties, and I suppose it puts a big smile on people's face, like Martin Ballard. He basically pillars us all the time, is that we can't get our act together, all the ones who are a separate state. And it's true. I mean, I think the issue in a lot of cases is the personalities involved, and the fact, like you say, I know Jeff not overly well, but he did come to I've met him a couple of times at our Boot Brisbane forums, and then same with supporters like Bob Catter and Robbie and George Christensen. I've spoken to Matt Canavan a number of times. Now, all these people are supporters in general, but they are not activists like ourselves. Like we're actually engaged in doing something and doing our research, and we've got some information rather than it's just a thought bubble. Because I think a lot of the problem is, I doubt if people like George Christensen, Robbie Catter, Bob Catter, and anyone else who generally supports us have done a real in-depth bit of research on what you need to do. Because while it seems to be a good idea, they look at it as in the emotional sort of type of thing, and in a lot of instances in their own parochial piece, and don't do the homework to find out what all the nuts and bolts are. And so that's the problem. And a lot of people are still, I would suppose, caught up in the fact that they haven't taken into account the growth in population of Australia, the real centralisation in these major cities, and the gradual sort of imbalance between the regional population and the southeast population in our country. And it's simple things like, I doubt if they've ever taken into account, well, what's the population quota for getting a federal seat these days? And I doubt if they would even know what the formula for getting the number for a population quota that entitles you to one federal seat. And just to bore you, it's basically you get the population of Australia about a year out from the election when it's first looked at, and that goes from the Bureau of Stats to the Australian Electoral Commission. And what they do is they take that population and they divide it by the number of senators per state added together times 2, which is 144. So they divide the whole Australian population by 144 and say, right, that's what you've got to have to entitle you to a seat, a federal seat. And at the moment, with Australia having 25 and a bit million, that quota is 175,000. So to have 5 seats, federal seats, you need a population of 875,000 people to get 5 seats. Now, and that would be a bare minimum for a state to have to ensure that it gets an entitlement of its 12 senators. Now, that's something, people probably don't think of. They think, oh, well, we're just North Queensland, and they don't think of elaborating on their borders. And that's the homework they need to do, and say, well, if we need a population of 800 something to make sure we get our 5 federal seats and our 12 senators, well, then they need to work out where the boundary south is going to capture that population. And they're just the basic things that they need to look at before and then they need to write down what they envisage as what's a viable state as far as revenue, population, infrastructure, and all those sort of things. So there's a lot of homework, but I don't think a lot of these people who support it and think that it's a good idea have actually done the homework.
Well, I think that comes back to what Max was talking about before when mentioning things like the Sydney Harbour Bridge and great visionaries like Bradfield and the engineers and nation builders that were, I guess, of a bygone era that were so forward-thinking that it could only bedazzle the people of their age. But I guess to some extent as well, could we put it down to the modern representative in both the minor and the major parties, especially in Central and North Queensland, being in a status quo feedback loop? Do you think that could look, I know it's a generalistic sort of a statement there, but do you think that they're so stuck trying to play the game in a system that's so broken that while they're treading water, trying to just do the best they can, they don't have the ability to really say, this is a great idea, we need to change? What's your thoughts?
Well, when I was working with Senator Ian MacDonald, I used to go to Canberra with him, and you guys would know as well as I did what a fishbowl of an echo chamber that Parliament House is. It's fully self-contained. It's got a pharmacy. It's got banking facilities, a post office, dining rooms, coffee lounges, squash courts, swimming pools, you name it. Now, the inhabitants of Parliament House, both upper and lower houses, are locked in an echo chamber, fed bits and pieces by kids straight out of university, their advisors and opinion groups, focus groups, marketing people, lobbyists. The place is a hotbed of seething interest groups. Now, someone like Bill, who goes down there with all his research and presents an audio-visual presentation, they would all be yawning because it's not all that important to them. What's important to them is the inner city Melbourne seats, the inner city Sydney seats, and where the big population bases are, because they want to get back into Parliament. They want to get re-elected. So where can they apply their money to get the most bang for their buck? So I think part of the problem is the echo chamber of Parliament House, where they're only hearing from the major the supporters of major issues like greenhouse gases and coronavirus, blah blah blah. It's very hard to elbow into the priority list to get yourself heard. And notwithstanding that, you've got 3-year election cycles where any sort of major forward planning has to get them re-elected in that third year. Now, as long as we've got these 3-year rolling election terms, we're going to have problems in getting our message across, because they spend their money where they can get the most return, and that's where the big population centres are.
Well, fortunately for us...
Well, I guess we're about to have 4-year terms in Queensland, so let's hope that we have some sort of hung parliament that can do something about the fact that we're about to enter into those 4-year terms. Now, sorry, Bill, you go.
Fortunately for us, it's got nothing to do... Getting a separate state has nothing to do with Canberra. It has got absolutely zero to do with them. It's simply the process. It lies in the hands of the state government. It's up to them to initiate the process. And basically, our job, as we see it, is to inform people of the benefits of a separate state and encourage the minor parties that are going into this election to support or have a separate state policy. So if they get into the position to form a minority government, that their commitment to a separate state will be part of the negotiation for the forming of the minority government, and basically initiate the same process. It's the same as what happened in New South Wales in '65. The Country Party was the junior partner. They had been badgered by the New England state movement for more than since the early 50s. There wouldn't have been a candidate or a member of the Country Party in northern and sort of northwest New South Wales who hadn't, buckled to the wishes of the New England state movement to make sure they got their endorsement. So they basically had a policy to support a separate northeast New South Wales state, and part of the negotiations with Askin prior to the 65 election was that if they won and formed coalition, the Liberal Party would support the then Country Party's position of giving the people of northeast New South Wales the referendum for a separate state, and that happened. And that's basically what's got to happen in Queensland. A minority party has to be, and that's only because neither of the major parties are committed to the Constitution of Australia, because the Constitution of Australia says that new states can be created, and really it was left in the hands of the states to initiate that process. But the two-party system, of course, they don't want to lose anything. They'd rather just milk Central and North Queensland for Brisbane coffers. So they're not going to come to it freely. So only minor parties centred on Central and North Queensland are probably going to be the vehicle to get us over the line and get the process initiated in the Queensland Parliament.
Yes. Could I ask a question, David?
Of course you can, Max. Go. Sure.
That group that Gina Reinhardt was involved with, the Australians for Northern Development and Economic Vision, I was hopeful that she might be, if not the messiah, the catalyst to discover a champion of Northern Australia. Have you had any conversations with that group or with Gina Reinhardt?
You overestimate.
Not myself personally. Bill's probably.
You overestimate our importance. We've sent heaps of correspondence, but you never get past the secretary. I mean, we just haven't got the people of influence who can get us in the door for the conversation. But I'm sure if we had an opportunity to deliver the conversation, we'd probably get a reasonable reception.
Yes, yeah.
So that's the situation. We know we've got the work ahead of us, but I mean, we wouldn't have this. I don't believe we would have this problem that we've got now if the National Party and the Liberal Party hadn't combined. If we still had a National Party that was sort of interested in regional Queensland, well, that would be our natural home to sort of what we would say, to fertilise in regards to the idea of getting a separate state. The same way as the people of New England engaged with the then Country Party, of course the Country Party was interested in the regions and was a significant force. So they were the natural home of creating a new state, whereas we just haven't got that in Central North Queensland. The LNP virtually is non-existent. I mean, they only have two members. I think the most northern member is the member for Burdekin. And then I think you've got Miller in Gregory, and then I think Boyce is in Clyde. But we don't count that because it goes too far south. I mean, right down the bottom of that electorate is Bell, and that's only 168 kilometres out of Brisbane. You know, that's completely out of the realms of sensibility. So that's the problem. I mean, if there was a significant National Party presence in North Queensland that wasn't tied to the Liberals of Southeast Queensland, we might have. They may be the vehicle. They would have been the natural vehicle for us to sort of try to encourage to adopt this as a platform. The KAP has got in their policy section. They have a policy, but it reads just like a statement of support rather than actual how they will do it or that. But Shane Knuth and Nick Demetto are very strongly on board a separate state, which is a little bit out of line with the executive of their party. Jason Costigan has it actually in the North Queensland First it's actually in their constitution to facilitate the achievement of attaining a separate North Queensland state. So that's in their constitution, and somewhere along the line, I expect they will come out with a roadmap and a policy and how they want to achieve that. If we could convince someone like the LNP to have such a policy, it would be well and good, and it would, make the task a lot easier. And it's strange, really, with the LNP. I think, as I said before, there's 11 ALP members in Central and North Queensland, and so if the LNP supported a separate state and cut off Central and North Queensland, that's 11 seats they wouldn't have to try to win for an election in Southeast Queensland. They'd probably romp in every election down in the southeast and control the southeast or southern Queensland or Queensland what's left. So it's strange that they don't cotton on to those sort of ideas. Oh, let's dump North Queensland and all those Labor supporters up there, and we'll just happily run Queensland itself.
I think the most beautiful component of the whole of the constitutional setup when it comes to the creation of new states, and taking the New England example into account, is that it is as simple as a minor party, avid in the fact that the situation is dire for their communities in their respective region, like it was in northern New South Wales. It wasn't necessarily dire, but they could see the injustice of representation. So that the simple acknowledgement of a hung parliament should initiate the process. But the most beautiful component, in my opinion, is that once that is initiated, so that comes to a referendum that only requires the population to vote inside of the proposed state, and it is only 50% of the population. So the people that have the ability to decide their own future can then take their place as a new state in the whole of the nation. And there's no other bodies to affect it. There's no two-party system, although they would have their own influences for the rusted-on voters of either party, or whether it's a minor party themselves. But the simple fact that the people decide to say, enough's enough, we take our place, let's be the masters of our own destiny, only makes sense. Because when you consider that even up here in Cairns, that Brisbane is closer to Sydney than it is to us, distance is alone not just a hardship for us from Brisbane, but more the thought of Brisbane not thinking of us. And to solve that seems fairly straightforward, all the more that support should flow to those people who avidly see that as a future for Central and North Queensland. I want to ask a question to you, Max. Did you find the years that you were up here in Townsville and, as you've said, Charters Towers, Innispell, especially working in media outlets, did you find, leading up to the end of the Joh Bjelke-Petersen years, that the National Party's demise was only a signalling point for this sort of situation to happen for Central and North Queensland?
Oh, absolutely. I think it was a disaster, the amalgamation of the two parties. I can understand the rationale behind it, and it's one of those exercises that on a whiteboard it looks fantastic and it looks like the way to go, but it's an oil and water situation, even though their marriage has been consummated and, we've had the honeymoon and so on. It's not a marriage made in heaven, I can assure you, especially amongst the older members. There's distrust and how should one put it, a certain philosophical disconnect between the Liberal Party and the National Party. There's no question about it. So the marriage of the two parties has resulted in the city-based Liberal Party taking control of the National Party. And that means less representation for the traditional base of the former National Party. Now, as I say, it's a great idea on the whiteboard and the audiovisual presentation, but it's just not working in the sense of getting services and representation for people in rural areas. One of the positives about Bill's presentation that we were fortunate to see the other day is that the survey results showed that 16% of people would be prepared to change their vote if the party that they if a party stepped up and said they would support a new state of North Queensland. Now, I thought that was the most telling figure, because 16% of people are prepared to change their vote. That should put the wind up any political party if they were to read that result. So there's hope, but to answer your question directly, David, the marriage is really quite a rocky one, and domestic violence is part and parcel of that union.
If I just jump in there, well, that's the things that surprised me. I mean, meeting your group with John Honeycomb on Monday, I find it strange. You're obviously all passionate sort of North Queensland and want it to develop, and you really had ties back to the old National Party, but you still seem to live in hope that somehow that Brisbane marriage and the Brisbane-based Liberal people will somehow come around to paying proper regard to yourselves. I just think it's strange that people like yourself and other influential people amongst the community don't see well, we've had enough of this marriage, and we need a divorce, and we're going to start. We've got to go back to our original roots and start a new party. And I understand. I mean, the merger prohibits the reusing of the national brand. From my understanding, talking to people, you can never reinstigate that national brand. So, but I do have a suggestion that those people who don't fit in with the Catters and don't fit in with Jason Costigan's NQ First, but are similar minds as yourself, I just don't see why you haven't pushed to create, say, a new party based on the old philosophy of the National Party, and that's registered and has its home in Central and North Queensland. It doesn't have its headquarters in Brisbane. It has its headquarters in some township in North Queensland, and it calls itself the Original Australia Party.
Yes, look, it's a very good point. Jeff Cox was looking to form a North Queensland party, and we had regular meetings, and everything that you can imagine was discussed, all the things that you guys are dealing with on a daily basis. And there was a mood to start something, but we didn't have a match to light the fuse. We were kind of looking around for a saviour or somebody to lead us, a patron. And we thought when Terry Mills reached out to us, as a dynamic politician from the Territory, and talked about joining with us to create a Northern Australian political body, we got our hopes up. But then Terry got involved in Northern Territory politics, and there wasn't a perfect fit between the Territory and North Queensland. And Jeff then got tired of pushing the barrow, and he's gone back to farming and doing what he wants to do. And as a result, we're still looking for that Messiah. And I think the other problem, just quickly, Bill, is most of the people who hanker for a new National Party type organisation are over 60 or certainly over 70 and are dying off. The young ones seem to have embraced the LNP brand because they don't know any different. And as I say, the elders are falling off the perch and the young ones are carrying the banner.
Oh, well, that gives you something to live for if you strive and say, well, we're going to do it. But I think there's a lot to do with the name, and I think when you parochialise it in, say, the North Queensland Party or the Northern Party or something like that, you're sort of locking that in. So you need something as a replacement, and I think just the Regional Australia Party is the vehicle that looks out far beyond the North. That just looks at what the problem is for all regional centres right across Australia, and fill that void that the LNP's completely left the field from in Queensland, and even in New South Wales. You get the feeling that their ties like Barilaro and that to the Liberal parties, they've been very poor representatives of regional New South Wales, because the shooters and fishers and those ones have made mincemeat out of them in some electorates, especially after their debacle against the greyhound industry, and also the forced amalgamations which came from the Liberal Party, and the National supported it. So even the Nationals, even as an individual party, a separate party in New South Wales, have sort of become too engrossed within the Sydney bright light sort of thing. So they've done a reasonable bit of damage to themselves.
Yes, well, I think we need somebody to lead this group out of the desert and into the greener pastures. And I don't know, I don't see that person around, but I do see a lot of grey hairs at most of the meetings I go to. And,
I think, gentlemen, we've just passed an hour, so we might start wrapping up some of our thoughts and bringing the podcast to a close, just so we don't rob any more of your Wednesday night, Max, and we really do appreciate you bringing us. But continue your thoughts, sorry.
Yeah, I just see a lot of grey-haired and wrinkled old men at the meetings I go to, and as I say, I look to the horizon and hope to see a rising star one day. And I thought it might have been Gina Reinhardt, I thought it might have been Terry Mills, but we're still looking.
Yeah, well, we're all looking for that patron.
Yes.
Well, you can definitely have somebody like the likes of Gina Reinhardt and the Gina Reinhardts and the Clive Palmers of the world, who have X amount of resources at their disposal to make active good change for the communities, especially the ones that they base their predominant industry in. But sadly, it's not the case. There's no rising stars when it comes to those of Australia. But yeah.
Yeah, well, we live in hope, David and Bill. And I must congratulate. I must congratulate you blokes too on the hard work you do. It must be frustrating trying to galvanise support from people, and you see the same grey hairs and wrinkled faces at your meetings that I see. So I sympathise with you.
No, I don't find it that frustrating at all. I just think it's just a challenge that you deal with, and as long as you've got a reasonable argument, and like I say, I dare any politician or candidate in the next election, if they're asked the question, do you believe the million people of Central and North Queensland are deserving at least the same political representation as the 520,000 people of Tasmania? And I dare them to say no, that we're not capable of governing ourselves, and we're not deserving of our own parliament, 12 senators, and the rest of the package that comes with a separate state. I think the audience would nail them to a cross, because basically I take umbrage at people like Pauline Hanson, who gets votes for doing absolutely nothing for us and just giving us lip service, when she basically casts a vote of no confidence in the million people of North Queensland and says, no, you can't, we don't support you governing yourself or being a separate state. So I think that come this election will probably wear pretty thin on the population, that the politicians coming up here soliciting our votes don't have the confidence in us to have that sort of representation and to be able to govern ourselves. And I think the candidates and parties that push that line are going to have a reasonable chance of taking votes off those parties that basically have no confidence in the people of Central and North Queensland.
And with the general population too, I find that, look, not because I'm a strong supporter of this notion of creating a new state, but I like to put people in three different categories. There's category one, people like myself, and we see the problem, we see it here, and we see that it's here now. Category two is the people that see it coming, and then category three is the people that don't even know it's on the way. And it only takes one fact for somebody that doesn't have an opinion on the matter to say, do you realise that this happens? And if you lived in Brisbane, it would not be the case. And they go, oh, well, that's not very fair. It's like, that is exactly right. And I think the main component is things will never change, and we're never going to see change happen on this sort of scale from a university graduate that enters straight into a system like in Canberra that you dropped a mention before, Max. And we're never going to actively see the change unless the community gets behind it. But with the electorate redistributions that happened in the way that they did only a few years ago in this state, we can only see that the 93 seats, as they increase over time, the ever-growing population of southeast Queensland will only diminish our representation more. And that is where the people in those other two categories will change their mind. But will it be too late? We need to act now. And with parties like NQ First, and with any other minor parties that might pop up, or even if one of the two majors decided to change their sway and say, this is a great idea, we should do it because it's better for the people of Central and North Queensland, all the better. But unfortunately, it's not the general population that's the hardest to persuade. It's the people that should be the leaders in this sphere. And Bill, you've told many a story that that's the case. Would you disagree?
Yeah,
with that?
I just can't understand that the business and community leaders can't see the advantage of having 12 senators in Central and North Queensland going down to Canberra and batting for you. I mean, the shipbuilding industry would have to be the prime example in Cairns, and I'm sure there's other examples throughout Queensland, but the shipbuilding industry of Cairns was once a hive of activity, building patrol boats and minesweepers, and then in 2009, North Queensland engineering assets actually won the contract to build the 3 air warfare destroyers in Cairns. Now, that was a major coup, and that contract was hard fought, and even people like Mayor Manning, Bob Manning, who's our current mayor, was on the groups that were raising that tender and were successful, and they won the contract. But the Brisbane government, all they had to do was provide a guarantee to ensure the infrastructure that they are ordinarily responsible for was in situ, so the ships, the materials and that could be delivered and provided for. And they refused to provide that guarantee, and that contract was forfeited to South Australia. Now, to me, I know Bob Manning seethes every time they talk about it, but they still rusted on to thinking Brisbane, which is the cause of their problem, is somehow going to be the solution to their problem, and it beggars belief. We continually have these groups that go cap in hand to Brisbane and Canberra for more handouts and that, and rather than saying, well, it's time for us to stand on our own feet and look after ourselves. And it's just mind-boggling that these leaders who have been around a fair while and seen the changes for the worst can't get realised the opportunities exist by having a separate state, having your own parliament, having your own 12 senators, and getting things done for us.
Yep.
Yeah, well said.
Well said, Bill.
Max, did you have any finishing thoughts? Because we might as well wrap up tonight's podcast. And we really do appreciate you taking time out of your week to share with us, especially late in the evening. So thank you for that. And
thank you, David, and thanks very much to you, Bill. I met Bill for the first time, pardon me, on Monday, and I was very impressed with the work that he's doing, and also commend him for I suppose, his persistence. It must be sometimes frustrating for you, Bill.
No, I'm fine. I can live with it. I've got some good people around me who help me and sort of, we don't really have too many setbacks. Our expectations of people our leaders in business and community and politics is not that high anyway. So we know the work is up to us, and we keep chipping away happily.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to be part of the movement, and if I can help in any other way, I'm only too happy to help.
Thank you very much, Max.
Yeah. Thank you, gentlemen. Well, we might as well wrap up the evening there. Thank you very much again, Max. It's been a pleasure. And if anyone's interested to learn more about the campaign to create a new state in Central and North Queensland, you can visit bootbrisbane.com to learn more and download any of the flyers and paraphernalia that we have on the subject. Likewise, there's a Facebook page, the one that started this one, Yes to a North Queensland State, and also a bootbrisbane.com Facebook page where you can keep up to date on anything topical on Central and North Queensland and how the politicians are swaying when it comes to the topic, and ultimately know who you should put your vote for if you like the idea any time a state election or federal election comes around, specifically the state election. So good evening, everybody, and good day if you're listening later on. And gentlemen, good evening.
Good night,
Thank you, and
Dave.
good night.
Max.
Good night.
Good night. Good night, Max. Good night, Bill.